everyone to the first conversation with Kids in Cyber, where I will be discussing with Dr. Dean Burnett the science behind children and screen time. My name's Megan Popescu and I'm the founder of Kids in Cyber. We have started an initiative where we want to help children learn more about the digital world they're growing up in through various mediums such as a platform that will be curriculum led, where they will be taught in schools, through free resources that we will give throughout to schools about staying safe online, and also chapter-led books that will guide children through story-led scenarios about different cybersecurity concepts. I'll let Dean introduce himself.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Dean Burnett. I'm a neuroscientist and author. I spent 7 years working as a psychiatry lecturer and tutor for an MSc psychiatry program. So, very, very well versed in mental health stuff. But then I sort of developed a sideline in writing and science communicating, and that took off. Seems to be what I'm particularly known for at the moment. I've written quite a few best-selling brain books about mental health and brain function and how that works. Use a lot in schools as an A-level reference text, which wasn't my intention, but I'm happy it turned out that way. And I've also written a couple of books aimed at the younger readers, like older kids and teens, about basically sort of inverse parenting books, telling them that what's wrong with your parents, but there's a sort of a stealth way to teach them psychology in a sort of friendly framework, and they seem to have gone down well as well. So yes, at the moment I tend to speak a lot about children's mental health and the effect of technology on them more often than not. To my latest book in various media formats, and yeah, that tends to be what I do now. So here I am to discuss it.
So to get started, I think one of the things we were going to speak about was what is the actual science and the evidence behind children and screen time? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is there a limit of how much time they should spend on screens? Does it harm them? What do you think?
Yes, well, okay, this question comes up a lot, and what I will say is that the dominant discourse around the effect of phones on and internet and screens on younger people is very, very different, very far removed from what the actual baseline evidence says. There's been quite a few big meta studies now of like all the different research into how mental health, particularly young people, is affected by regular exposure to online platforms or the internet or phones, and various different ways of describing it. Meta studies, when they put all those together and look for overall patterns and trends and stuff. And it's been a few times now, but if there is, based on all the data, if there is a link between phone use or internet use, social media use, and worse mental health outcomes, it's a very, very, very small one. Like the studies, the way depends on how you assess it or analyze it, but the ones that show there is a link, it's extremely small, smaller than the link between eating breakfast regularly or potato consumption. According to this data, those have a worse or more significant impact on mental health than phone use. Now, this isn't to say that phone use or using phones as kids is completely safe and completely harmless. We're talking about the big picture here. There are reported cases of someone becoming mentally unwell or like adopting different negative mental attitudes or behaviors because of excessive phone use. That can happen, definitely, but also there are just as many, perhaps you could argue even more, examples of people's mental health has been protected or improved by something which goes through the phone, done by the phone. I think the term like screen time is a useful shorthand for the general discussion, but in the scientific sense, it doesn't really mean anything, because screens are everywhere. Now, you can actually, walk down your average high street and you will be confronted by 30 screens from your house to the bus stop. On the bus stop, there's probably screens on there, advertising hoardings, like shop front windows. They all have screens everywhere. And that's you can, if you're looking at those, does that count as screen time? If not, why not? And I think that's sort of a big problem with the screen time discussion when it comes to children. And like if you tell them you've had too much screen time, now do your homework on the laptop, they're not stupid. They will realize that, well, why is this screen not count? Why is it's only screens that they enjoy, that they like? And I think that's a very, very unhelpful stance to take when you're talking with kids who are going to be savvy to that sort of thing. They do sort of learn to, they learn to distrust, they learn to doubt what they're being told. Again, the evidence what we do have is not the best. It's not sort of totally comprehensive, because we don't know the long-term effects of what it's like to grow up on constant phone or internet access, because there hasn't been a long term yet. Smartphones are 20 years old as technology, and it became just ubiquitous a bit after that. That's a fair amount of time, but no one's gone through their whole life from early age to retirement age with a smartphone yet, because they just that hasn't there hasn't been enough time for that to happen.
No,
So
I
at a
think
very
it's more
interesting
this
point.
generation, isn't it? Like
Mm.
I mean, my daughter's 7, so she is of the generation where when she was born, it was like, here's the Amazon tablet with all the kids' games and
Mm.
things on it, and the screen on the telly on the wall of the cartoons. That I think has been relatively new. What does the science say about like attitudes and behaviours of children who spend a lot of time on screen? I don't know. I mean, obviously this isn't anything scientific, but I know myself as a parent, when my daughter was spending a lot of time watching cartoons and things on a like Amazon tablet, she became significantly more irritable. She was short
Mm.
tempered. She was a bit more snappy. Her moods and her attitudes weren't great. And then I would say to her, right, I think you need to have a break from this. I took it away from her once for like a week because her behaviour was so bad. And she just changed. She was good. She was going outside. She was listening. She was just better behaved than when she's sitting like this. Is that just, I don't know if that's just
Yeah,
my daughter
that's
or is
no,
what
I
the
feel like quite
science behind that?
yeah. No, I feel like quite a few people, and I do think that will be something to be conscious of. Um, I think it's because I wouldn't necessarily a tablet. The technology isn't doing that to your brain. I think it's the fact that when you give a small child, especially a young child,
Mhm.
like uninterrupted access to stimulation, to novelty, constant novelty, they'll sort of adopt a headspace where that's what they're expecting.
Mhm.
And when you sort of interrupt them, that will be like, that's jarring. And I think that it happens with adults too. Like if you're in the middle of a good book or something, you know any sort of modern technology, someone keeps poking you, like, oh, stop it. I want leave me alone. So that is sort of like a normal effect of brain function. But the fact is, if you do it too much, it will leave unhelpful
Mhm.
results, much more adaptive. So like when your kids are thinking, I can stab my parents, I just want to gravitate to this now, it can be unhelpful, definitely. So that's not something you should sort of, me might let my kids have screens, but we have limits. Okay, like so you can have an hour now, you can have 2 hours there, because that ability to learn sort of self-control, self-restraint, to be able to say, okay, I have done with this now. That's an important part of growing up too. It's like we don't let kids have uninterrupted like sweets or anything. So like you can have one or two,
Mhm.
and it might help to treat it like in this regard as well. I'm not sure like how much data there is in that, because it's kind of hard to measure like attitudes and opinions about things like that, especially when you're young. Because obviously,
Yeah.
I think it's also going to be, it's not unfamiliar to them. I think that's one of the big sort of sticking points in the modern discussion. Children who have technology and have always had it are being raised by parents for whom it arrived later on. I think it's basically a generation of digital immigrants who went from the non-digital world to digital world, raising digital natives who've always had it. Like I tell
Mhm.
my son, who's like 13, when I was your age, we didn't have the internet, and he like, he doesn't believe me, but he can't comprehend it. It's like sort of like I'm
Yeah.
telling him, when I was your age, there was no such thing as rocks. Like, what do you mean? Of course there was. They're just they've always been there. How is that possible? Like and
Makes you
that's
a dinosaur in their eyes. I think, how can
well,
you not have internet?
precisely,
How
yeah,
could you it's kind of like us with, I suppose, my generation, millennials, with maybe maps. I'll be on the sat nav with my husband, we'll be in the car, and I'll be like, how do people get around with a map?
yeah,
Like,
well, exactly.
not
So,
telling them, take the next right, take the next left. How
yeah,
did they get from A to B? It's so
yeah. The idea of
complicated.
going from like I live in Cardiff, going to like Skegness with like an A to Z. That doesn't like that sounds terrifying. It sounds totally impossible. But it was done all the time. It was the done thing, wasn't it? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um, I think. as well, what do we know about how does technology affect a child's ability to learn? So does it do any sort of damage? So if you have a child in school and let's say they have unlimited screen time, they're on it all the time, they're on phones, they have social media, they're doing TikTok, which I don't know really what the science is saying behind that right now with the constant, because my brother is like dead against the whole TikTok things. He says it shortens kids' attention span because it's
Mm.
just that's constant go, 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 and the information's too fast. A child like that vs a child who is not on any sort of digital, do they fare better in brain development than a child who is being
Yeah.
exposed to this constant stimulation?
There, it's one of those tricky ones to pin down, like in either side of a particular divide. But I think in terms of development, I think it's a different question to ability
Mhm.
because you know people think like, well, if you're always on TikTok, you're not reading books, and therefore your brain doesn't develop as much. But TikTok is still stimulation; it's an information. No, it's your brain is still dealing with a lot of sensory input and context and people's information. So it's dealing with information. So you could argue that well, no, that's just as you could argue it's even more quote unquote stimulating than a book. So your brain has to learn to deal with that. So there is like sort of it's not like you've shut down all streams. Like it's not like people say brain rot, but being able to interact with an online platform and like jump from tab to tab, from video to video, that shows like a diverse attention span. You're managing information streams. You're shifting focus really quickly. That's a skill in itself. So it's not going to sort of stop the brain developing, but I do think slash believe it is hamper the development of abilities. Like people say it's attention spans. I don't think you're going to sort of break or disrupt on a fundamental biological level a kid's ability to pay attention, but they don't use it as much. And I'm finding that in my own work, which like I've been part of this uh, national program to teach kids about the consequences of head injuries in school students and sports players. The Head for Change charity, and I wrote the whole thing because it's my area. We've had some feedback and people like it, which I'm pleased about. But a lot of kids saying, "Oh, it's too much reading. So I don't like to read this much." And I would say it's not that much reading at all. Like maybe it's like 10 pages. Like we've got like an hour to do it. It's not like overwhelming. But
Yeah.
the fact that they just don't, they're not used to reading generally, and that is, I think, an unhelpful thing. I'm not saying like reading is the be all and end all of all information processing, but it's a healthy and a useful ability to have. And I think that is lost is too strong a word, but that's not being as developed. That that ability, that muscle is not being exercised as much, and that is, I think, not something ideal. I think that should be focused on. I think there should be more done to sort of showcase like you have to read stuff as well. My son will read, but he only reads like 4 or 5 different types of books, and he still loves his YouTube shorts and things like that. And I do, I would like to keep an eye on that at least. And I do think it's going to be, I know, especially if kids are younger, then they prefer to absorb information in the short video format. Okay, you can have a discussion about that, but then it'll come to a point you have to read something. Like you have to be able to read something for long periods, and that is going to be an issue. And it's not like they've irreparably damaged. You can easily work that skill back up, but they will not want to. They'll sort of like, oh, I don't like doing this because I've never had to do it. That makes it more an uphill struggle. So yeah, I do think it has the potential to impact on how children learn if it hasn't already, which it may well have done. I don't think it's irreparable. I don't think this is like sort of with a lost cause, but I do think it's something which we should be paying more attention to. Ironically, I suppose.
Yeah, I do wonder if there is a link between the fast, constant moving information processing that's happening with children in terms of, the flicking and the shots and the going from tab to tab. Because
Mm,
sometimes when you sit down with a child and you try and get them to do a little bit of homework and a little bit of math, I don't know if it's because it's the subject or whether it's just because they're not learning to just sit and have a bit of patience because they're constantly doing things where they're flicking from activity to activity,
mm,
they're going from screen to screen. It's like I want to play on the games console and I want to watch videos and I want to do, and it's like it's as if their mind is going at a million miles an hour constantly, that when you're like sitting, let's do a bit of homework, let's do a puzzle, within 2 minutes they're frustrated because things are not happening as fast as they are in a digital world, if that makes sense. Things are, I
Yeah.
suppose, in the brain being processed so quickly that when you ask them to sit down and do an activity that takes more time, takes a bit of patience, they just don't seem to have it. They just seem to want things done now.
Yeah, I mean, if you're used to that, if you're used to, like, sort of, I get my information in short 30 seconds to 1 minute bursts, then your brain will think, okay, if you're especially young, think, well, that's how information works. That's how I do things. So I'm not used to, if you haven't got experience at paying attention to the same thing for more than like 2 or 3 minutes, then yeah, it'll be odd. It'll be unusual to have to do that. And that is, not great. That's not ideal for learning. There are obviously, it's one of those things of, okay, it's not, it's not doom and gloom on either side. It's like, yes, but that ability to take in information so rapidly. I mean, there was a time when that was considered an intelligent thing. Someone flitting from book to book and moving. That was like, oh, this guy's a genius. That was portrayed then. Now all kids are doing it, and it's like, oh, no, it's not. So, but that means, like, then that doesn't mean it was correct years ago either. Just like that was someone with a particular
Yeah.
way of engaging with the world, and it was unusual. So we thought it was, no, cool, look at that. But now it's like, oh, this isn't ideal, actually, now I think about it. So it is a tricky thing to sort of pin down and sort of say, yes, it's bad or good. But yeah, in terms of how we teach and how we learn, and I do think the self-control required to sit and pay attention to something for longer periods without having it be, attention grabbing, stimulating. I think that is an important skill, and one that should be reinforced, as best we can. And I think, obviously, people point out now, a lot of YouTube videos are like hours long. Like they're still quite manic. They're still quite, engaging, but there are still long form formats which people like. Like podcasts tend to be getting longer and longer and things like that, and that's fine too. So there's options. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the whole TikTok thing. I might not. I guess because I don't know really how it works. But again, that's a much newer technology again. So any data we have about that is going to be very raw and very new and novel. So yeah, it's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think people talk about TikTok and its addictive algorithm is an
Hmm.
issue. Um, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe you could explain what exactly is going on in the brain when you're exposed to, like, you're on your phone and you're watching these TikTok videos and you don't know what the next video is going to be. But
Hmm.
there's something that's going to grab your attention and make you want to watch it. And I know, I mean, even my dad, who is in, God, his 50s, I'd send him a video and he'd say, I don't have TikTok anymore. And I was like, oh, there's a funny video on it. Why not? And he's like, because I was up to all hours, just like, you,
Hmm.
you just can't stop scrolling. It's so addictive. Like, you just keep, it's like an addiction. You're really waiting on getting that one video that you're going to think really funny or really engaging, and you can't stop scrolling until you find that video. And people will make jokes about it and they'll say, don't have the patience to watch a film tonight, but spent 3 hours on TikTok. And
Hmm.
it does seem to be very addictive. And I think that is the biggest concern for parents with children is TikTok is, and then YouTube adopted it because I think they seen this
Hmm.
is addictive. People are on the platform, let's do YouTube shorts because it's the same concept.
Yeah. I think once anything becomes successful, the other tech giants will just glob onto it, and then we do that as well. It just becomes that's capitalism, and just like marketing and stuff. I do sort of balk a bit at the use of saying something's addictive because that's obviously an official psychiatric term. It's a medical diagnosis, and the idea that something compared to that, I do think that muddies the waters a bit. But I won't deny that it's compulsive. It is compelling, and it does to the point where it can be unhealthy. And I know some people say, "What's the difference?" Well, there's a whole clinical criteria for it. There's a long history there. I'm not going to get into that, but yeah, definitely there is a compulsiveness to it, and part of it's to do with it's the things your brain generally tends to like. Low effort stimulation and rewarding stuff. So pressing a button, looking at something, enjoying it. That's very minimal effort, no energy expended, and you still got the rewards from it. So your brain tends to like that. Not necessarily a lazy organ, but a frugal one. Is in like what's the least investment I can get for the maximum reward it'll tend to do that because that's a survival instinct. If imagine if you're a creature in the wild trying to survive, if you spend 4 hours chasing a single mouse, then that's not going to really sustain you. You've wasted a lot of energy. So your brain learns that I cannot afford to squander my resources for nothing. So basic rule of thumb in the brain: low effort, good reward is very compelling. And that's what these videos do. Novelty, brain always likes novel stuff rather than familiar stuff, but it also likes safe stuff rather than uncertain stuff. So things which are new but in a familiar context, like this real sweet spot, which is what the algorithms do, of course. Like we know what this person likes, we know they like this kind of stuff, like this range of things are what this person likes, but let's show them new stuff in that category. Perfect stuff. It's not challenging, but it is new, like that. And the brain doesn't like leaving things unfinished or undone. So I think, okay, that's why sort of books aren't as addictive sometimes. You can just, but you can't stay up all night reading. I said addictive myself then, compelling. Sort of you can stay up all night reading because you want to get the end of a chapter. When you get the end of the book, like you put that down, cool, go to sleep. Whereas a social media feed doesn't have an end to it. Unless of course the internet shuts down at some point, everyone just stops posting at once. It's always the next thing, always the next thing. You get this with doom scrolling too, like something's happening, something bad is happening, and you're getting all these updates, and you can't sort of get to the end of it because it's ongoing, it's rolling. It's there's constantly something else more. There's no end to the narrative, no end to the story. The brain likes it because, okay, what's the beginning, middle, and end here? That's how events work. Social media and feel like I'll stop that happening. Like, no, the next one. There's no obvious cutoff point, so you can be more and more compelled by it. And I do it myself. I'll be up late reading just the same feed over again, new post, and it is, it draws you in.
Yeah.
Because it ticks so many boxes.
I think it's lagging a bit
to be wary of.
So I don't know if you're getting that on your end.
Lag. So, no, I didn't notice anything. Sorry. So
okay, that's fine. So one of the things I wanted to touch on as well is they talk about children being exposed to content that's not age appropriate. So whether that's anything violent in nature, sexual in nature, even when you talk about violence in nature, they'll say, oh no, that's not good for a kid that's seen that. It's not good for the development in them growing up. But it's not good for an adult either, is it really? I mean, I remember one time when Facebook brought in this autoplay of videos. Before you had to press play on the video and then just autoplayed. And one day, me and my brother were working together, and he shouted, "No, I should never seen that." And I'm like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I just seen a video, and it was a camel that basically lost its head in the desert." And I was like, he says, "It's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I can't forget it now." And I'm like, "Why are you watching things like that?" And it just popped up. But they say if children are exposed to things like that, it can be damaging for them. But is it not damaging at any age?
Yeah, but it's never good to be sort of confronted with content that you're not comfortable with or you're not in the headspace to process right. Like having something like brutal or something, even if it's like from a nature show, just thrust into your face when you're not expecting it, that is really jarring. That is sort of like cause a lot of negative reactions, and that's obviously going to put you in a bad headspace, and that will happen, like I say, at any age. What that content is will vary considerably depending on who you are and your own backgrounds, what your own personal experiences are. Some people have certain triggers and traumas, and we don't know what they are ahead of time because we don't know them, and they could easily be confronted by that. That's why trigger warnings exist. Not so saying you can't read this, and saying if you are upset by these particular references, then you shouldn't read this. And I think that's very straightforward. But of course, other people object to that as well because that's just how the world works now. But I think it's particularly significant when you're young because you're especially when you're like your older child or a teenager, you are still figuring out how the world works. Like you haven't had the sort of gradual build up to the sort of experiences and the sort of material that you would get in the older days, when in like the 80s and 70s, when access to media was a lot more restricted, a lot more constrained. And I think I mentioned this in my book, but especially obviously the big conversations around sexual content, pornography, or like stuff like that, which young people are far more able to access now than they were. And there are some people who would say this isn't might be a sort of it's a trade-off compared to the old days when you could actually especially in Britain when completely aggressively restricted to everyone, and that's not healthy either. That gives us a very weird mindset of because obviously sex and sexual desire are a part of life, and to cut off all material relating to that gives you, completely upsets your ability to learn about it. And there's a whole school of thought about that. But yeah, when you're young, if you've got access to the internet's worth of adult content, then you don't know what's normal or what's not. Especially with some sexual stuff, it's such a significant, such a substantially stimulating and foundational part of growing up. You hit adolescence, you hit puberty, and suddenly you have these desires and yearnings that you haven't had before, and you don't quite understand, and you don't know what to do about them. And that's one argument, is that when teenagers develop these powerful crushes on somebody, become obsessed with someone, it's like they fall in love with them from a distance. People think it's illogical. Oh, why do you get so obsessed with this one guy you saw in passing? But that is an evolved thing to sort of help you experience the romantic connection, to practice it in your head and learn about it gradually without the risks involved. Obviously, now we can have access to certain content at any point, and you end up sort of jumping 10 steps ahead, because obviously you access the more explicit stuff and the more hardcore stuff at this age. You can never actually encounter the earlier stuff. Then that completely sort of disrupts your gradual process, the gradual process of getting to that point. Not everyone has to get at that point, but usually it would be you just build up to it. It's like you play a video game. You start off you start the game, you're like a small character with no real skills. To build up, you have to earn your power ups, your level up, and everything.
Yeah.
And then you fight the big boss. This is more like just start the game. There's the big boss. Get him. Like, oh god. And then it's I think works it really sort of throws off the developmental schedule, because it makes you think, oh, this is normal, is it? I guess no, it really isn't. That isn't anything normal. But when you're younger, when it's the first thing you encounter, or you encounter it too early on, it can lead to skew development, or you have to learn that. Think is that what do women like that? No, they don't. That's not what anyone likes. But it's common material, and that's that's something that teaches a bad lesson in that respect. It's at such an early age. It can be quite foundational then, when it shouldn't be.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we briefly spoke about before was, and this is a really big one on social media, LinkedIn especially, with the people that's involved in this space and conversations, is the link between mental health and children. So they'll say there is increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal tendencies, and they're being increasingly linked back to smartphones. Smartphones seem to be at the moment the root of all evil. There's never been more depression and anxiety, and it's because people are on social media and they're being exposed to all this, all these people that are pushing these suicidal tendencies and these eating disorders, and it's fueling how they're feeling and, in a sense, pushing them over the edge. But a lot of the mental health is being blamed to it's the technology, it's the smartphones, and it's definitely the social media. Is there a link? I mean, is it phones, or is there other things that people are just not seeing that's causing this increase in mental health in kids?
Yeah, there's loads of different aspects to consider here, and it's got to the point where smartphones, because of the time they're introduced and the time the numbers started going up, are a very convenient thing to point at and blame. And also, it's sort of an easy answer too, as in kids were fine, smartphones came along, kids are unwell now, and that's a very compelling narrative, but it isn't something the evidence supports, because there's so much else going on. I mean, numbers started going up in terms of mental health rates increases before smartphones and social media was so commonplace. So that it suggests there was always a thing before then as well. Other things to consider are that we are just better at recognizing mental health problems now. So that will cause an increase in the numbers going up and globally, generally, which is what we're seeing. In the States, a lot of the numbers come from, like, Obamacare was introduced, and that means currently like thousands and thousands more children had access to mental health services and could report issues, and therefore the numbers went up. And obviously, there have been massive societal shocks in the last 20, 30 years. We've had like financial crisis, we've had like a pandemic, and these are things which will have lasting legacies on children's mental health. Like, how many children went through the possibility of losing their house, or like not being able to see any of their friends, and all things. This is pandemic stuff, but in the 2000s, we had the big financial crisis. Countless people lost jobs and fortunes, and prospects and lives were ruined, and that will have knock-on effects on mental health of young people. And like some people say, well, the economy is better now, they're still happening. Well, yeah, that's not how mental health works. So there was one big shock, and then mental health is bad from then on because it hasn't been treated, it hasn't been dealt with. And it's general awareness. We've had like 30 years worth of mental health awareness campaigns, and that will have the result of people being more aware of mental health and therefore be more aware when it goes wrong. So these are all factors that will feed into an increase in levels of mental health problems, and the general economic situation for young people. It's no longer the case that you just work hard in school, you get a job, you'll be fine, or you get a degree, you'll be fine. They're constantly being told now, like, no, you can't ever have a house, you can't ever leave home, the environment's going to hell and back. And that's these are all things which will add up to despondency and loss of motivation, and things which are going to impact on mental health. The smartphones also, they tend to be given to children when they're like 11 or 12, which is when they hit adolescence, which is when their behavior starts to shift and change because they hit their teens. So, in like 1880s, like children that hit 13, they become moody and miserable and detached, because that's happens to a lot of teenagers. Now they got a phone as well, so the parents blame the phone when they should actually be blaming teenageness. Like the developmental processes that affect mood and well-being when you hit your teens, and the sort of the cycle impact of that as well. So there's loads of different factors at work, and as I say, the evidence shows that smartphones overall, or social media access generally, doesn't have that much of an effect on mental health. Like I said, it can. There are cases where people's mental health declines because they get involved with, very bad content, or communities which sort of exaggerate or have negative impacts and influences, or cyberbullying or things like that. But there are also plenty of examples where smartphones have been good for mental health, and with finding supportive communities, or having be able to express themselves. There was a study not too long ago of interviews with teenagers, or people who subjects who attempted suicide as teenagers, but since then have still stuck with social media and like the smartphone use and things, and like ask them why, if your smartphone was causing you this problem, why are you still with it? And they said, well, it wasn't that. It was found a community. I was struggling in my own life, and this was like a lifeline, but sometimes it got on top of me. And my recovery has been helped by being able to reach out to people and have supportive messages. And I think people tend to overlook, because the conversation around smartphones mental health is obviously going to be dominated by concerned parents talking to other concerned parents, which is totally valid. But if one person thinks, I think it's the phone, it's like, oh yes, I do, and then that opinion becomes dominant and sort of the most influential one. But logically, people who aren't involved in that debate are the non-concerned parents, the not so good parents, the ones like who we should be more, perhaps, their kids are the ones we should be more concerned about, because they're not getting the help and support and they get at home. At the very least, they could be having, could be being abused, they could be being neglected. And for kids like these, the online communities, the resource they find online, could be an actual genuine lifeline. And so to take it away from them, as most people are proposing, would do them serious harm. Or like the idea of, okay, kids can have smartphones, but their parents monitor everything they do. That way, for so many kids, so many vulnerable children, that'll be a much worse outcome for them. That'll make their lives much worse, and their mental health will suffer as more than it already has done, because the one thing they have has been taken away from them. Like the only resources they have, the only support they have, is being denied them by other parents who are more concerned with the potential risk to their children, which isn't proven, than they are with the genuine risk to vulnerable children. And that, I think, is often very much overlooked in this debate, things like that. And if you want to sort of look at any sort of, again, it's impossible to study this directly. That's why the debate is so nuanced and so confusing, because we can't say screens and social media has had this effect and only them, because everyone's life is full of all different factors. But at the start of the pandemic, the lockdowns, people like health board organizations were monitoring the mental health of the population. All the different cohorts of population, they did obviously report decline in mental health, as you would in a sort of lockdown situation. You've lost all your
that was reported to have quite significant, and that's why I think it's important to have these conversations, because there is such a passionate community surrounding this area, and I think it's so easy, and it is so easy to say, we want to protect kids, we want to help them, and it's natural for parents and protectors to want to find that one thing to blame and just shut it down, and then that's the end of the problem. Once we shut down the smartphones and we get rid of it in the schools, which I think is a good thing, not having a smartphone in school. I mean, why would you need one? You live to learn.
that. Yeah.
But they take it out of schools and let's ban social media and let's put age restrictions on, and then everything is the end goal, that everything's now going to be okay. Like the kids are going to be mentally stable and the world's going to be better. Is that what we're trying to do, or are we really trying to look at the science and the facts and say what is really going on with kids and the way they're feeling at the moment? I mean, do you find that there is an age that a child should have a phone? Because I went into schools recently and they say, and I think it was like some of the studies online, some of the studies online, they were saying the average age is about 10, 11 for a smartphone. And I'm like, is it really? Because I went to the schools and I spoke from primary 3 to primary 7. And I went in and I'm like, okay, so easy one, put your hand up if you have a smartphone. And most of the class put their hand up, primary 3 and primary 4. And I'm like, no, not your mum's phone that you get to use sometimes, your own phone. And the hand still stayed up. And I'm like, do you have a phone? And they're like, yeah, he's got an iPhone. And I'm like, well, what do you do on it? And they're like, we play games and we're on YouTube. And I'm like, do you have kids' YouTube? And they're like, no, just normal YouTube. And I'm thinking, is that too young? I mean, should we really try and hold off with kids here and let them have their education and their playtime? Do they really need to be communicating with each other outside school at 7, 8 years old? Should we delay them having a phone?
I think there's something to be said for that. Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting parts for me was when I researched my book. I went to lots of different schools, talked to the different age groups about what their attitudes towards phones and stuff. I got generally the conversations you have are far more almost like more informative, more useful, more nuanced than you get with concerned adults, because, like I say, kids are growing up with phones. They don't have the paranoia on them, which tends to influence most older people's debates. But one of the interesting things I found was, like I said, so what age do you think given a phone? So I spoke to like 15-year-olds. They said, I think I had one when I was 13, but any younger than that, that's too young. And I spoke to like 13-year-olds. They said, well, I had mine since I was 12. But younger than that is weird. And I spoke to some 11-year-olds, and they say, well, I have mine when I was 11, but any younger than that, that's weird. And they ask a 10-year-old, like, any younger than me is like, they always think, yeah, fine if I have it, but anyone younger is, no, that's wrong. So even weirdly, kids have their own sort of conception of too young to have a phone. They all agree that it is a too young age, but they disagree on when it is.
That's too young.
Yeah, and I do think like 7 and 8. I do think that's excessive. I mean, my daughter has an old phone in that, so she can play little games on it and watch a bit of YouTube, but it's not connected to any sort of communications. She doesn't, have any ability to call friends or whatever, because we don't think that's necessary. And like none of her friends have that either, I think, and maybe they do, but again, they don't call her, so that's obviously. But I think the general surveys suggest that it's like 10, 11. I do think in most parents' heads, or most parents' like perception, that's like when they last year of primary school go into secondary school. And that's like a sort of real significant milestone. Is it, okay, you're older now, you're mature now, I can trust you to go to this big school and go to different classes and have all this stuff with you. I guess like sort of a lot of parents, that might be just a case of, well, might as well have a phone then, especially when you've spent what 7 years with this primary school environment, and then they're going off somewhere mysterious, somewhere that you don't have access to, and them having a phone means they can stay in touch with you. I think a lot of parents might find that reassuring. Like the parental side of things is obviously a bigger aspect of this. So I don't think there's any sort of scientific reason for that, unless you want to sort of associate it with the onset of puberty, adolescence. And I do think that maybe there's something to that. But then, like I say, that sort of leads to the misunderstanding of, like, my daughter was really sweet and I gave her a phone and now she's all moody. Yeah, she just turned 13. That's, you just happen to give her a phone at the same time because she turned 13. It becomes a circular thing of, well, yes, no, like, but then I did it because of that. It becomes really hard to unpack. So yeah.
Is it not the case? I actually just thought of this just now there, because I've always been in the thought, when they're teenagers, it's probably a better time to give them a phone. But now I'm actually thinking about, because obviously not much, but I studied a little bit of neuroscience at college. I was going to do it at university. And I remember them talking about brain development, and I think they said the early teenage years are when you are the worst decision maker, you're at your most impulsive. Is that not the worst time to then give a child, well, not a child, but a teenager a phone? Because they're now at this age where they're really starting to be impulsive, they're exploring things, they're going out of the boundaries, and then we're giving them this thing that's just, allowing them to explore all those possibilities without them having the sense to think, I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be doing that.
That's one argument, certainly. Like that, I can certainly see the merits of that as well. I think it's hard to say that that's your worst decision making time, but it's not the best. Definitely, there are other ways to go about it. Because obviously, it's when we hit the adolescence, your emotion system is, everything in your brain's been upgraded, so like it's been refined and turned up high to adult level. But because the different parts of the brain are more at different levels of sophistication, the simpler stuff upgrades first, which is like emotional impulses and instincts, and the complex stuff, self-control, rationalization, that takes a lot longer because it's a much more sophisticated brain process. So you have this period of emotions strong, rational thinking not as strong. They could do it, but obviously it takes more effort and more work. So yeah, there's certainly that argument to it. But then you got that, it's going to happen to them regardless where they got a phone. The bad decisions are happening online, like in the digital world rather than the real world. Because obviously we've had, I grew up a lot of kids who had poor decision making skills when they were like 12, involved vandalism or like destroying stuff or injuring themselves because they were trying to do something ridiculous. I mean, I've seen people huffing aerosol cans and sort of setting fire to things, and it's like that. If they had like a smartphone, maybe they would have done that online, which would have been a more
because
healthy approach.
there has been a lot of deaths, and a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there has been several cases where children have died doing these online challenges that they found through social media. And again, I think this is another reason why parents are saying just ban off social media for kids of a certain age, because if you're an adult and you see these, you know what they are, they're silly, they're reckless, and the dangers. But if you're young and impulsive and you're seeing these challenges and you think, oh, they're funny, and your friends are egging you on and say, go do it, do it, do it. And kids are doing these challenges and they're dying as a result. I think this is another reason why there is such a push. Look, kids are just too young for social media, because there is way more harm than there is good. But then again, it circles back around to what you were saying. Does it cause way more harm than good? Because you were saying there's a lot of people that rely on this for communication purposes, that maybe in vulnerable homes, vulnerable situations where they need it.
Yeah, exactly. There are, yeah, that's true. Yes, so kids get stuck into these weird online trends, which I do disagree with. I don't think that's. I hate pranks and trends at the best of times, so I'm not going to. I'm not exactly impartial there. I just find that the whole thing frustrating that it exists at all. So that's just me. Yeah. So actually, kids will see a bad example and they'll follow it, and the consequences could be terrible. And no one's arguing that. That's a thing. Again, it comes back to the whole. Yes, that'll happen, but also that could happen outside of phones. But if they didn't have a phone, that wouldn't have happened. But on the counterpoint to that, I guarantee you there are countless LGBTQ young people who would have, wouldn't be alive now if it wasn't for them finding their communities online. There are plenty of young people who are fully aware of what consent is or what mental health is because they were able to access it via phones and stuff because they grew up in even if it's not like an abusive community, a intolerant community to their own personal experiences, own personal beliefs. There are plenty of people out there now who are still alive as young people thanks to what they found online. And that doesn't get the same attention because obviously you can't really measure that. You can't, there's no sort of news story in someone didn't die today. That's not, that's great. But obviously you can't really, that's as it should be. And that's the norm we all expect. So it doesn't get any attention, but it is a thing, very much a thing. Like, there's so much support in the data. And like I mentioned, the lockdown just now, but I say all the cohorts showed decline in mental health. But the first few months, the one exception was adolescents and teens. And, lots of different factors to that. Like they didn't have to go to school. They weren't missing out on anything, which are all stresses for young teens and stuff. They got more sleep because they weren't sticking to a schedule, which is a big part of adolescent problems. Like they don't get enough sleep because school starts early. They don't get they have an alternate sleep cycle, which nation. But this was a situation where, young people who had nothing to do but use their phones and communicate via social medias and platforms like that. So if they were, as some people think, definitely causing mental health problems, they should have been the worst affected. But they weren't. Like their mental health was the most stable. It declined eventually because obviously things go on, things wear off and stuff. But but that was a perfect situation to see. Like, but now they got nothing but smartphones. So if they are bad for mental health, we'll see their mental health overall go through the floor. And we didn't. We saw the opposite of that,
Yeah.
which they have a lot of protective effects too.
Yeah. I think this is one of the reasons why I decided to create Kids in Cyber, and it was to have consistent education from a young age about technology, not just being online, but learning about technology, having a love of technology, because I found in playing between primary 4 and 5, that's when they wanted to actually learn about technology. I spoke to them and I says, if you could learn anything about technology, what would it be? And nobody was saying social media and I want to do this and I want to be an influencer. They were all asking me, how does software work? How can you create a game?
Mm.
How do algorithms work? And I was surprised because I would think that's something that someone a lot older would ask, but they're in primary 4 and they're going, how does AI work? How does ChatGPT work? How does algorithms learn? And they've got this curiosity and
Mm.
love about
Yeah.
learning. And that's why I think something like Kids in Cyber that teaches them religiously from a really young age. I mean, you speak to a lot of people, and sometimes you'll speak to schools, and they'll go, "Yeah, we have cyber security sort of." Someone comes in once every 6 months and talks about the dangers of being online and they leave. And I'm like, but is a child really going to learn about being safe in the online
Mm.
world? A police officer standing there say, and you don't do this, and you don't talk to strangers, and you don't do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see in 6 months, and the kids are like,
Mm.
okay. I suppose that's why this was created. But sometimes I'll have people say to me, should they be learning at such a young age? Should we even be bringing this subject up at all in primary schools? Let kids just be kids. But I feel they are online and they are there younger, and
Mm.
they do seem to get themselves into some situations. And I think it's good to speak to parents as well and say, look, you have to have these open and honest conversations with your children. Because one of the questions I asked in school was, have you ever seen something online that made you upset, scared, or worried, or felt like you wish you hadn't saw it? And a lot of kids put their hand up. And I was like, have you spoke to your parent about this? Mm-mm. And I'm like, why? Why not? And they said,
Mm-hmm.
because my mum will take the phone away. My dad will take the phone, they'll take the console. They think by saying to a parent, look, I've seen this and it concerns me, that parent will say, right, give me the phone, you're not getting it again. And I think parents should be made aware of this and they should be able to have open conversations with a child to say, if you see something that concerns you, we can speak about it. You're not going to lose
Yeah.
access. It's just we can talk about what it is that you've seen and how you came across it.
Yeah, I do think that's absolutely the right approach because I think when you sort of, again, like I say, your phone it's a big part of childhood now, and I think a lot of parents are not quite grasping that. In that you think, well, I didn't have it when I was a kid, and neither should you. But that's not the world anymore. We don't. So much of childhood happens online now. Like I say, just discussions and interactions and sharing funny things and like you're dancing again. It can be healthy, it can be not, but it's that applies to every child group in relationship. It happens more often and more over distance or on the phone. But there is this idea that if you just get rid of the phones, the problem will go away. It won't. Even if it's well meant, even if it's like sort of a healthy approach. I've seen people say that, yep, my kids have their phone off at 8 o'clock, and that's the absolute last. And they get more sleep, they get more homework done. Great, it's obviously good for them, but they end up becoming slightly more ostracized because with all their friends being online, the conversations go on through the night because they're all up in bed just messaging and stuff, and that's whether you like that or not, it is happening, and like the kids out, the phones out at 8 o'clock, and not being part of these conversations. So it's a more nuanced issue, and I do think like very much like the approach of, okay, you saw something bad, take it away, okay, get rid of that because I don't want to risk that again. If someone's out and about, if your kids want go into the park and they see someone dealing drugs or they see someone like approach them, do you keep them in forever? No, you don't. That's like, oh, that was a bad thing. Let's talk about that. Let's make sure you don't, you know what to do in that situation. And I think the same logic should be applied to the online world. Okay, what did you, like I say, what did you see? How did you get there? Let's talk about why that was not good and how to avoid that happening again.
Mm.
That's, I think, the way to go about it. Because, like I say, the kids don't enjoy it. They didn't want to sort of like, oh God, what the hell? That's not something they sought out. And if they did, that's even more important to have that conversation. Why did you look for that? Why do you want to see that? What is it about that intrigues you or compels you? And let's talk about why you shouldn't do that. Or like, let's hear your stance and then let's go from there. Because especially with older children, like we talk like 10, 11 onwards, one big part of growing up is developing your own identity, your own autonomy. And the more parents say like, no, I'm in charge still, the more they react badly to that. Like they pull
Yeah,
away, they
for
withdraw.
sure.
When you just put up barriers rather than open communication, then you become less and less able to influence what they're going through, and that is counterproductive in that respect.
A lot of people had, I think we touched on this recently before. A lot of people has asked me, "Have you read The Anxious Generation? It will change your mind, and you'll be like, right, that's it. No smartphones, ban them. Not in schools." Obviously, the author of the book has a big push towards. He's running all these campaigns. I think he's on television a lot. He's
Mm-hmm.
co-writing another book at the minute, and there's a lot of hype over this new book. But everyone's speaking about the anxious generation is like one of the must reads for parents.
Yeah,
Is
I
it
mean,
any scientific founding in what he's saying?
no, I would say the exact opposite. I think it's a very bad idea for parents to read it because, as someone who is like a neuroscientist of some 20 years and who has read it and dissected it, I don't think it's written in good faith. I think it's a very cynical book. What it is doing, and very successfully, I won't deny that, is taking the paranoia of many parents of our generation, the ones who buy and read books more often than not, and confirming their fears with some uh, credible sounding intellectual arguments and science. And that's obviously incredibly compelling. You think like, oh, I'm afraid of this thing. And then this book comes along and said, you're right. And here's why. That's, people will want to read that. They want to read that and go, I see, exactly. I knew. Telling people that they're right is always a winning strategy, but it isn't scientifically supported. Like you quote lots of studies by these 2 or 3 scientists who say, that is bad. But if you look at the actual field itself, there's like 2 or 3 scientists, himself included, and everyone else on the other side saying, no, that's not how it works. That's not what the data says. And even his own arguments are very, very sort of flawed and limited because even the stance is like the book seems to say like social media exposure definitely damages children's mental health. When you consider how many young people are on social media like on a regular basis, we should be seeing much, much, much worse mental health outcomes. If it's only like 1 in 1,000 who has a smartphone who has like a mental health problem, which we can't pin on, can't really pin on social media use, then this argument sort of falls down in that respect. So, like, if it's as bad as what everyone insisted is now, as soon as a kid has a smartphone, their mental health goes to the toilet, then every other child should be in serious mental health crisis, and they're not. So the actual observations don't support the argument. You can find little patterns in the data and everything, but it's a far more complex and nuanced picture. And like I say, the idea that they can have good impacts and positive effects on mental health is never even discussed or even acknowledged. It's all like, it's a very ideological and cynical book, I find, but it's a compelling one. It tells
Yeah.
concerned parents what they want to hear. The concerned parents drive the narrative, and obviously they vote a lot. So that's where it becomes a self-sustaining thing. So yeah, I personally think that book has done a lot of harm in the grand scheme of things, and I'm one of the people trying to push back against it. But telling parents that they're wrong about stuff, not as effective a marketing strategy, in my experience.
Yeah, I remember there was a post a while back about something, and I had commented on it. It was about a scientific paper, and I had commented that I agreed. The science for a lot of things at the moment is very weak because, as we
Hmm.
spoke about earlier, you can't really have a true scientific study on does social media damage children's mental health. I mean, I don't know. I'm very much on the science side of things. Like, I need to see the proof. I need the evidence of studies and what's going on. And I think they kind of got a bit annoyed at me. They're a bit like, you're supposed to be,
Hmm.
for this and children and them not having phones and things. And I'm like, I am definitely pro children being much
Hmm.
safer online and learning about technology. But this the science when people say studies have shown this, and I'm thinking, but what studies? Because to be able to really do a study like that, like we spoke about, you would have to have a group of children from toddlers and expose them to certain things, and then say 16 years later, how's your mental health? And then have a bunch of children, like you said, that had no social media to be able to find out, does social media have a direct link on mental health? And I think this is where the debate will always be stuck, because
Hmm.
you can't really study this, can you?
No, not in any sort of controlled laboratory way, which is what you'd need to do to get robust data of any sort of conclusive, not conclusive, but any sort of persuasive sort. Like I say, you need to have a big cohort of children, like hundreds, to sort of get with the statistical power to be meaningful, and then give half of them that you have social media 6 hours a day for the next 12 years, and you have none for the next 12 years. And you can't have that sort of level of control over young people's lives, not children especially. And I'm sure there are some parents who would be willing to do the second thing at least, but that's a whole other thing. So if you got that, if you got a sort of your child being raised in an environment where they're under such control, such scrutiny, that will have significant impact on their mental health and their development.
Yeah.
So you can't separate that from it's a lack of smartphones, or is it just like complete 24/7 surveillance from overly concerned and paranoid parents? That's going to have mental health impacts. You can't separate out all the other factors at work there. And again, people have pointed out, and it's totally valid, that the data we have, even though it doesn't say phones lead to mental health problems, that's not entirely conclusive either, because I say it's the data we have. And like I said, we're still in the relative medium term for how they affect people long term, because we haven't had that much time yet to study the effects of these things. I know it's like you can quote like lots of studies being quoted about screen time and the effect of that. A lot of them are from the 80s and 90s, when by screen time they meant television. So like there was like a sort of phrase being used then. Like I meant to start my book, like parents keep saying when I was younger, if you stare at the TV too long, you'll have square eyes. I mean, that was
Yeah.
obviously a concern then.
Someone
Uh,
actually asked me that in the school, and I didn't know what to say. I was like, "Do you keep up with what your parents are telling you?"
yeah.
So, like, does watching the telly give you square eyes? And I'm like,
No, but
um,
funny, it's still a thing. Yeah, parents still say to their kids about phones. But so the kids have told me that. Because, oh, so you do know that reference? It's just not. It's about the phone rectangle, not the TV, which is further away. So yeah, so it's still a thing.
I'm aware of the time and that some people might want to ask you, so we need to leave some
No,
time
it's
for
all
if
good.
anybody wants to ask you any questions. But just briefly to touch on your book, I have been reading through this. I know it's not aimed at my generation, but it
Well,
is
sort of
very
is.
interesting nonetheless. But can you tell us a bit about your book and what inspired you to write it? Because before, I think your first book I read was The Idiot Brain, and I loved it so much. It explained the
Thanks.
brain in such a fun, humorous way. And I think if anyone struggles from their mental health, The Idiot Brain is a must read, because it really sets things out why sometimes you feel the way you feel and it just doesn't make any sense. But what inspired you to get into writing about children and the smartphones? Well, not
Yeah.
just smartphones, but phones.
Just going to say that Idiot Brain Anniversary Edition published early next year. So, 10 years on, it's been a while now.
Wow.
Yeah, like I first started writing, I never thought I'd write in children's books because obviously I thought that was a separate skill. But an editor from Puffin, the Penguin children's label, we had the same sort of same agent, and he reached out to my agent saying, "I got this idea for a book for kids, which is basically, like I say, a reverse parenting book, because all the literature about parents and teens aimed at the parents on how to control their teens and understand them. You say, well, how about flipping that? So like, here's teens, here's why your parents are so weird, in terms of, but use that as a way to explain brain development and experience,
Mhm.
stuff like that. I thought it was a great idea. And I said, well, do you fancy writing it? Because I do. That would be cool. So cool, we need it in 6 weeks. Because okay, that's a challenge, but sort of got there in the end. But yeah, so that was the first book, Why Your Parents Are Driving Up the Wall, What to Do About It. What about the classic arguments parents and teens have? Like, do you treat this house like a hotel? How was school? Things which tend to lead to conflict between parents and teens, and trying to explain why that happens in terms of brain and psychology stuff. Went down really well. I haven't liked it, especially in Poland, for reasons I'm not entirely sure about yet, but I'm not going to complain. The Polish people really liked it. Um, and of course, then they said, well, when one book goes well, they want to, like, do you ever think about doing a follow up? And when I did write that book, one of the main conversations was like, or one of the big chunks of it was, what about kids and their phones and like kids on social media? Is that something to worry about? Kids, parents are concerned about kids having too much access to stuff. And there's a chapter about that. But in the interim, this is like 2019 it was published, and especially with lockdown and everything, the conversation just like ballooned into become far more part of the mainstream discourse. And it's not so much like a side issue with parent and teens; it is like the problem, the issue. And then obviously, Anxious Generation amplified it further. So the whole thing got blown up into this big, ongoing, rolling
Yeah.
discussion.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, that seems to be like where the conversation's headed. So I want to hopefully contribute to that in some useful way. And so, tell kids, okay, your parents are giving you grief about your phone. Here's what the actual data says, the actual science is, and here's why they're wrong. Also not. I know, but then I did a sort of the classic sort of opening chapters, like, here's why your parents are dumb about phones, and then gradually say, but they're not
Yeah.
really. They have some very good points, and you shouldn't do this. And yeah, it's a stealth sort of guide to healthy phone use, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I thought that was important, something to contribute to the debate, and I stand by that.
Is there going to be any more books surrounding children and technology or smartphones or even the consumption of technology?
I don't know yet, because we are sort of like, this is still, it's been out less than a year at the moment, and I've got other. I keep saying adult books, not adult books, but because that sounds I'm writing erotica, which I'm not, absolutely not. But I don't know how else to say non-fiction, mature. No, can't even say mature readers. It's like, now that I've said it, it's hard to. But anyway, my standard output. I've got other books in the line there. I have sort of been doing a lot about children and sport, and like the old head injury campaign I mentioned, and that
Yeah.
might be something I'll look into next. I did, okay, kids, sport is good, because I think when I was younger, I was very much not into sport, and still not really, but I should have been. It would have been healthier for me. But also, here's how it affects your brain if you're not careful. I think that's an important message too, especially like like the age of constant YouTube clips of Ronaldo and things like that, or like so. Yeah, so I think that might be the next move.
Yes, that'll be interesting. Well, thanks very much for joining us and having this conversation today. I think it's really important
No
to
problem
have
at all.
these conversations and host these conversations online when there is such debate around the subject at the moment. And so many people do want to help. And I believe there's a lot of people in this space that have the utmost best intentions for children
Hmm.
and to help protect them. There's just a lot of people that's coming at it from totally different angles and approaches, and from reading books like The Anxious Generation and trying to find some studies online, and then the parents that are really upset about what's happening with children.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has their own idea how we can solve this. If anybody has any questions for Dean, they can put them in the comment section and we can go over them.
Oh,
Um, but in the meantime, I think you were saying in your book that it's important what they consume on screens, not how
Hmm.
much time they have on screens.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the general consensus about the people who are trying to get a more evidence-based approach. It's quality over quantity. Like the idea of having like an hour of screen time a day and that's healthy or not healthy. I think that's a distraction of a debate because you can, my son is reading a book on an ebook on his phone. Like spent like an hour doing that. That wasn't going to stop him. He's reading a book, or he was watching like this nature thing for school, and like an asthma documentary on the iPlayer, and that's screen time. But obviously, I'm not going to dissuade that. That is
Yeah.
ideal, or even just like watching a film with a family. That's nice and sort of engaging time, and he's spending time focusing on long form formats. No, it's but if he's like, spends like 2 minutes on an explicit website or something which encourages one of those male influencer types, that's bad. That's bad screen time, and it can in the first 5 minutes, and I think that's a distinction which is harder to pin down because the amount of time is an easily verifiable quantity. You meant about 2 hours, you've had three, that's too much. Or you snuck away, that's
Yep.
it's much easier to control that approach. Whereas, what are you watching? Why are you watching it? What's it telling you? It's a harder discussion. It's a harder thing to monitor, but it's probably the one you should be monitoring. How you do that obviously depends wildly on the different child and parent relationship, but I do think that's where the focus should be.
If you had any advice for parents and teachers about technology and child's development, what would you say to them about all the parents out there that are really worried and think, we really
Yeah.
need to push on delayed screen time? I had someone in the comments section that was speaking to me about her view of screen time, and she was really pushing this narrative of, I think she said something like no screen time from 0 to 3 or 5, and then it was maybe 40 minutes a day, no educational technology, no phones, and then I think about 8 or 9 introduce a very basic phone, and then I think it wasn't until her idea would have been early teenage years that you would actually introduce any sort of technology, but it would be severely controlled. And I was thinking it was a very restricted view of children today to try
Hmm.
and really condense it that small.
Yeah, I do think there's lots of different things I could and have said to concerned parent groups and things like that. I do think one thing which should be at the forefront of everyone's mind is like these interventions. Who are they for? Are they genuinely for your child and their well-being, or are they for you to settle your concerns and your fears? Again, are you pleasing? Are you doing it for your own well-being or theirs? Sounds like an obvious no-brainer, and of course it's for the kid. But what do they want? I think a discussion is far more important than a blanket imposition of rules, because every parent is coming at it from the perspective of their own childhood, which is going to be very, very different to that of their own children.
Yeah.
And again, with the best intentions, I don't doubt that for a second. Like in works, we favor positive memories over negative ones. They tend to fade faster, and therefore we have a more optimistic view of our own childhood than is perhaps the case. So we all want to give our kids as good a childhood as we had, at the very least. And we see them not having that because it's happening right in front of us, and we think something is wrong. What's different than my childhood? They have phones. We didn't. And that's where you get those, memes on Facebook and stuff like, share if you spent your childhood doing this, playing outside in the trees rather than this over a phone. And I never liked those because like it suggests that there were smartphones in the 80s. Just our parents' generation just turned them down because of moral fiber and self-discipline, and that's sort of like I don't think that's really the case, but you crack on. But yeah, but I do think I think we should face the situation as it is rather than as we'd want to realize it most, because I know we'd love to have the ability to give our children a smartphone free, an internet free world, isn't the world we live in. Like the internet is a big part of every part of life now, and that includes childhood. And navigating that with your kids and giving them the best possible experience is, I'd argue, a more healthy approach than trying to shut out that for as long as possible. Because, if it was, if your kid was only on the internet, maybe that would work. But if it's like, I suppose they're not being raised in a bubble. They do have other friends and contacts, and they see other people within, and they're going to feel like they're missing out, and they are. And that is, that's not be a great thing for a healthy parent-child relationship. So I think, yeah, accept the world as it currently is and see what you can do about that, rather than trying to recreate a time which isn't there anymore. I know. So like, yeah, basically use the evidence rather than
I think it's very, very, very difficult, and I can see why there is such a concern for parents. And I know they're saying, like, I can understand your side of things and the arguments about, that there is no, there's not a lot of science on kids and mental health and what to consume online. And I suppose even myself as a parent, there's a worry of desensitization because they seem to be exposed to just, I mean, I feel like when my daughter was small, she loved all this Halloween stuff. She was around about 6 or something. She loved all this Halloween stuff. And she was like, Mom, can I watch these? Like, it's these animatronic videos in, Home Depot in America. And she's like, Can I watch them? Can I watch them for 5 minutes on your phone? And I'm like, That's fine. Don't worry about it. Here you go. And I let her just watch these. But obviously, she went a wandering on to the next video, on to the next video. And she's looking at these, obviously the thumbnails that are enticing her. And I think there is a convention in America called, I think it's Trans World or something, and it's basically all these really graphic animatronics that are made for maybe, props for like movies and
Mm.
things. They're very realistic. And she clicked on this video and I heard her like screaming and I'm running through and I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, it's scary. And I looked on the phone and I thought, oh, and I was so annoyed that she had seen that. And since then, I've actually never let her have my phone. I suppose I have been one of those parents that children at school say, they're scared. I don't let her have my phone anymore because I feel like the risk is too high for her to go, oh, 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 and then land somewhere that she's going to see something that she can never unsee. And I think that's what's really
Yeah.
scary for parents. They don't know how to navigate that, and it's very hard
Mm.
to restrict.
Yeah, totally. And I do think that's obviously a risk, and obviously is something to be concerned about. And I do think this is where the conversation should be aimed back at the tech companies who provide these things and who supply this content and material, because I don't think it should be entirely up to the parents to regulate all their kids' screen time, like on the off chance that the algorithm shoves something upsetting in their face. I think that's a big ask for so many parents and kids. That is the ask that's being made. But obviously, when your Facebooks and TikToks are making ludicrous sums of money from just channeling this stuff towards people, I do think there's a responsibility on behalf of them and maybe the governments to say you shouldn't do that. You should definitely have more robust, more well regulated. I know it's easy to say this, so I don't know that technology works, but I do think just giving them free reign to say, "Oh, that's nothing to me. I'm like." There's always that sort of cop
Yeah.
out. Well, we're just a platform. We didn't share this. Like, well, come on now. There is more to be done on their part, and I think that because they have so much money and power, they just often overlooked. I don't think that's a healthy approach either. I do think there's more to be done on that side as well. But yeah, it is obviously a concern. It will be, something which will happen. But again, it's also something which can happen without phones and too. And I think that's something which it's less likely because you're not going to wander the street horror makeup and gore and things like that because just down your road. But it's something which is worth bearing in mind that again, this is a risk of kids being on your phone and stuff. And I think if there were better checks and systems in place to filter that out or just make it more child friendly, I think that would be helpful all around. Yeah, I do think it is too easy, or there's just too little regulation to just stop kids from just wandering into stuff like this. And I think that is an issue which definitely does need concern, attention.
They definitely need to find a way to filter out videos that are completely inappropriate. And it's easy for people to say, why is your kid not on? I mean, my daughter's not on YouTube at all anymore. I give her because she's only 7, she's so young.
Hmm.
And I give her the Amazon tablet, the one where it's
Yeah,
like,
Yeah.
pre-populated with some games. She's always complaining about it's boring, and I'm like, well, go play and do something else then if it's that boring.
Yeah.
But I do really restrict her access at the moment because I just find her to be so young, and I just want her to keep that innocence for as long as she can. Because I feel like she's got plenty of time to have a smartphone and do all these things when she's a lot older. But I do think that there has to be a way, and there should be a way with AI and technology these days to try and filter out this inappropriate content. I mean, I think I read an article not that long ago that had said that the people that filter the content, I'm not sure if it was for Facebook or not, and they're not suing them for trauma
Mm.
because they have to assess all these videos. I mean, it's an actual person that decides whether something's
Yeah, I think that's
appropriate or
Facebook.
not,
Yeah.
and they're seeing so much content that's
Mm.
just so bad in a day. I think a lot of them did not say they had PTSD or something.
Yeah, I think that's Facebook. I think I remember reading about that. I think there's a book about that now as well. I don't know what it's called, but it's meant to be quite eye-opening. I do think again, I think it comes down to the cost in it. Like when if tech companies have to filter content, then that means like they have to pay someone to do that, or hire or create an AI to do that. So either way, it costs them something, and there's no way to recoup that costs. Obviously, so they're reluctant to do it. I don't think that's a good enough excuse. When you're making billions on a weekly basis, I don't think like, well, yeah, I don't want to spend a couple of 100,000 on protecting kids. Well, that's not really a valid argument, but it seems to be one that carries the day. But yeah, I do think I'd be amazed if there wasn't more they could be doing
I
relatively
think
easy.
there is as well, and I think I mean, I don't think people realise that a person's filtering the content, and that's why so much. If you think about the amount of content that's created in a day,
Mm,
you would see in the grand scheme of things, it would be impossible right now to take all the bad content off because it's not it's not going through some sort of check that's going through an automated system where it's like bad deleted, they won't let you upload it, they won't let you upload it. It's very much a person that's
mm.
doing it. And I think they definitely need to find a way to just get rid of all that content that's just not good at all.
Yeah, well, I'm okay with that personally. So yeah,
Yeah, but you don't
yeah,
think there is a specific age that a child shouldn't have a smartphone? Do you think it's more to do with where the childs are, or do you think there is an age
yeah.
where they think, you shouldn't really have social media till you're 16 and a smartphone probably 13, 12? I'm guessing you wouldn't want to put an age limit on things.
Yeah, but I think it comes back to the point I made, I think earlier. But a smartphone, is not really a self-contained thing. Obviously, it's just access to the internet in so many different forms. So a smartphone very much is what you do with it. And you
Yeah,
can access the internet, but it does other things too. Again, plenty of games on there, like chats and things like that, and that's a whole other suite of functions. So, say if you give your kids smartphones, so they can look at Disney Plus, like my daughter does. I don't think that's necessarily bad. Like she's had that since she was like 5, but she just wants to watch a video. Like she doesn't actually want to get online or like she wants to see. I want to see these Disney films I really love. Which again, when we were when my sister was 7, my cousins were 7 back in the 80s and early 90s, we would put like Little Mermaid on a loop for them on the TV, and that was fine then. That wasn't sort of seen as a thing. Smartphones just make that process more convenient. So I think if you want to do that, I think early age is fine. But if you are actively trying to, or thinking that you should give your kid full unconstricted access to the internet from age 6, I don't think that's a good idea. No, because I think you need time to learn these skills and develop them.
yeah,
But I do think there's also the counter argument about also that if you stop a 16-year-old from having any online access or internet access or smartphones until they hit 16, then they've got sort of almost adult level autonomy with absolutely no experience and no awareness of how this world works.
yeah.
And that's going to be, I don't know. I wouldn't say a guarantee that's a better setup. That sounds like it could be much worse because obviously they've got all this like, oh my god, at last, like, and then they don't know how things. And that's
Yeah.
again, this is where the debate also is happening. Like, okay, so yeah, is that better though? Is that a good thing? I can't guarantee that. So yeah, as you can see why it gets so confusing so quickly.
Yeah, I think that's why I was saying like Kids and Cyber's there to help children learn about technology from a young age. But people always take that, like the internet smartphone situation is you're helping them learn about it from a young age, i.e., I'm teaching them how to use Snapchat at 6. And it's like,
Yeah,
well, it's not about that. There's so much more to technology and learning the fundamentals of being online than social media. Social media is not the be all and end all. Phones
mm,
aren't the internet. There's so many other ways we can scaffold learning their approach from a
yeah.
young age before we say, okay, you've learned all this stuff. You know, you should be able to put it into practice a bit better now that you're older and you're coming onto these devices.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like it's it's not the best comparison, but obviously, so many parents complain about kids being taught sex ed in schools at a young age, like 13, 14. But it's not like this isn't going to happen. It's not like they aren't going to want to know about this stuff. It's a biological imperative. So when you just restrict them from knowledge, which is helpful, that just because your parents don't like it, that's not necessarily a good approach either. Like then you put them in. Eventually, they'll get to the world where they can access it without any sort of insight or awareness of what's what and how things work. And again, that sort of ignorance can be even more damaging. So yeah, I do think these conversations, the earlier they happen, probably the better. So like, this is the world. This is the thing you will be encountering. Here's how to do it safely. Here's what you should look out for. I think that's a perfectly logical approach to have. Just obviously because parents are so concerned about phones generally, it gets wrapped up into that sort of overall fear of what could possibly happen. And I think that's something else to be worked on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. I think that's, as we went over about 7 minutes, but thank you very much for everybody that attended today. It's been a great conversation. Obviously, it's important to keep these conversations going and look at the science and the data and speak to scientists like Dean and obviously parents and other people that are involved in education, teachers. And it's good to keep the conversation open and see everyone's different points of view. And thanks very much again for coming. And thank you very much, Dean. It was great to have you.
Thanks a lot for having me. Much appreciate it.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right.